Professor Denise Walsh, and dear participants, good afternoon, good morning in US, and namaste. Welcome to a very special webinar on culture and women's rights in liberal democracies. Before I start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To talk on a very interesting topic of today, we have very distinguished professor, Professor Denise Walsh. Professor Denise Walsh is currently a professor of political science and women, gender, and sexuality at the University of Virginia. She researches the relationship between political participation, women's rights, the degree of democracy, and women's advancement during period of democratization. She has a master's in political science from Columbia University and PhD in political science from the New School for Social Research. Professor Walsh was also the co-founder of the Power, Violence, and Inequality Collective, which she co-directed from 2016 to 2019. She published the book Women's Rights in Democratizing States, Just Debate and Gender Justice in the Political Sphere in 2010, along with publishing in several reputed journals. Professor Walsh has been honored with many awards like the Hannah Arendt Award in Politics by New School of Social Science Research, Social Research in 2006, and the Best Desertification Prize by the Women in Politics Research section of the American Political Science Association in 2007, and the University of Virginia All-University Teaching Award in 2014. Professor Walsh, welcome once again to our program. Kindly make your remarks in around 20 to 30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. The program is streaming live on Facebook and several other platforms. We would like to request all our participants to drop their questions on Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live. You can also tweet or WhatsApp the question if you want. Professor Walsh, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pramod. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if that's all right.
Sure, please.
Lovely. All right. So thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's terrific being here with you your afternoon, my morning. A lovely way to start the day is to share my research with all of you. So as you mentioned, some of my earlier research was on women's rights in democratizing states. And I'm happy to talk about that topic in Q&A. But what I wanted to do today, of course, was to share with you some of my more recent research, which is on culture and women's rights in democracies. And the question that's sort of been nagging at me over the past couple of years as I've been doing this research is the one that you can see on the screen. So is a clash between culture and women's rights ever really necessary? And that's what I'm going to try to get at a little bit today in our time together. So the clash that I'm talking about is one that politicians, pundits, activists, and scholars often ask, right? They often use this phrase, harmful traditional practices. What should be done about these harmful traditional practices, such as child marriage, dowry, and accusations of witchcraft? And these three that I've plucked out are, of course, ones that the United Nations often talks about in regards to Nepal. And the answers to these questions tend to be one of three options. And the first option is the one that the United Nations has often opted for, and this is to promote women's rights. So many people argue that practices like these must very much end, and that powerful Western democracies like the United States and everyone else should do everything they can to save women from these cultural practices, which often get wrapped into this word culture, right, which tends to be a catch-all bin for religious differences, ethnic differences, indigenous differences. It all gets put under this label of culture. And this argument tends to pit culture against women's rights. Now, there's another option out there. There's some people who argue we really need to protect cultural differences, that we should do everything we can to try to respect these differences, and that we need to find out why a particular group practices this tradition. They have different standards and ways of living, and they may have good reasons for doing whatever it is that they've chosen to do. So we should find out. We shouldn't jump to judge, and we shouldn't jump to women's rights against culture. So this argument, of course, is the opposite argument of the one I just presented. So culture over women's rights, but notice both are pitting these two against one another. Then, of course, there's a third option, right? And that option is compromise. So some people have said, look, we understand these two things are at odds, but perhaps we can work some way together to see if we can find ways in which they might agree. So for instance, some people have argued we can change the practice, we can modify it. So you might be familiar with female genital mutilation. Some scholars have argued we could change this kind of cutting practice to a pinprick, and all of the traditions that are surrounding it could still go on, but instead there wouldn't be so much harm to women. Others have argued, well, let's try to broker a compromise, right? Liberal democracies could compromise. They could bring together advocates of cultural rights, advocates of women's rights, and we could find some way forward toward agreement. Neither group would get exactly what they want, but we would hopefully see more tolerance and also some advances on women's rights. So those are the three options that are out there in the world, and I think they're all bad, actually. So, women who are at the intersection of these two identity groups, right, who are members of often marginalized or minority cultural religious groups in democracies, they're women and they're also members of these groups. And so they need both their rights as women and their cultural rights. And none of these options give them both. And it seems to me that people often forget this truism when they're arguing about culture and women's rights. They forget that women need both. So what I wanted to do is bring to life some of these arguments that I just presented with actual examples that are out there in the real world. And right now, a lot of people are arguing about the hijab. So I wanted to take you to three very different countries where people are arguing about that, and give you three examples to illustrate some of the reasons why I've said that all three options are bad. So of course, the example that I'm thinking many of you probably came to your minds as I mentioned this is Iran. So since 1979, the government of Iran has mandated that women wear the hijab. And their reason is that they want to protect Iranian culture from Western secularism and materialism. And this has been referred to as West toxification. So to the Iranian government, culture trumps women's rights. Now, of course, this has not been uncontested. And quite recently, Mahsa Amini died in custody after being arrested for allegedly not following the dress code. And there have been massive protests in Iran following her death. People, especially women, rushing into the streets, tearing off their hijabs, throwing them in the air, right, burning them in the streets, and demanding women life and freedom, right? So demanding women's rights. India quite recently has had the opposite situation. So in early February of 2022, the Indian state of Karnataka banned the hijab and all religious garb in public schools. Obviously, they're arguing to ward off Islamic fundamentalism and protect women's rights. This is, of course, part of the agenda of the Hindu Nationalist Party. And in this respect, women's rights are supposed to trump cultural and religious rights of a attacked really a minority, a Muslim minority in India. Now, once again, women have protested, right? They're demanding the right to choose what to wear. They took their cause all the way to the Supreme Court. And quite recently, a 2-judge Supreme Court panel made a ruling and it was split. So we don't know what's going to happen yet in the case of India. We'll have to wait for that larger panel that will hear the case. But for now, girls in Karnataka who wear the hijab cannot attend public school. Now, bring you to the United States, where I'm standing. Women have, of course, the legal right to choose what to wear, but many of them who wear the hijab report discrimination, harassment, and even assault. So in practice in the United States, I would argue what we've actually got going on is at best an uneasy compromise on women's right to choose what to wear. And this, I think, is really vividly illustrated by when we think about what's been happening with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. So in 2021, Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, who's a Republican, accused Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, of course, who's a Democrat, of being quote unquote evil and against the Constitution because she wears the hijab. Now, of course, Omar fought back, taking her case to the public, but she continues to face death threats on a routine basis. And so this is obviously not a good outcome for her or for women who wear the hijab in the United States. So what we've got is Muslim women in all three countries, I would argue, have been courageous political actors, confronting powerful states and hostile citizens. And some of them have experienced discrimination, injury, and even death. But these are obviously bad outcomes for women, regardless of where we stand on the culture versus women's rights controversy. And unfortunately, these experiences are not uncommon, nor are they restricted to Muslim women who wear the hijab, nor are they restricted to these three countries. So I want to take you to three very different countries with different contested practices, ones that I've been studying recently, to try to flesh out some of the problems with this culture versus women's rights debate. So France, of course, notorious. France has been notorious for its treatment of Muslims, as well as for the ways that it's ruled on what women can wear. So many people in France in the 2010s were asking, should Muslim French women be allowed to wear the full face veil, even if nearly everyone in France, including Muslim French, thinks they shouldn't? And the French government said no, and it banned the full face veil in 2010. The government, of course, claiming it must prioritize women's rights. Now here, an anonymous Muslim French woman, known only by her initials, S.A.S, in order, of course, to protect herself from retaliation, challenged this ban at the European Court of Human Rights, which oversees 47 different countries, but she lost. So since 2010, no one in France has been able to wear the full face veil in public. Bring you to a very different country, right? A post-colonial state, South Africa. Think about the 1990s when Nelson Mandela was still with us. In the 1990s, people in South Africa were asking themselves, should men in South Africa be allowed to marry more than one woman, even though women can't marry more than one man? And nearly all South African women agreed that polygyny should be abolished. And Nelson Mandela's government said yes, it legalized polygyny in 1998. And the government argued that it must make African culture equal with European culture. And this is why it agreed to legalize polygyny. Now, African women in South Africa continue to challenge the law in the courts, but the law still remains on the books. Very different country, once again, let's go over to Canada, has a renowned global reputation for being fantastic on women's rights, as well as on cultural rights. In the 1980s, politicians there, as well as many Indigenous people, were thinking about the marrying out rule. There, the problem was, should Indigenous women who marry white men lose their Indigenous citizenship and essentially become white, even though Indigenous men who married white women didn't have to lose their citizenship? And of course, to change the rule, the government would have to override chiefs who favored this marrying out rule and then reinstate women's Indigenous citizenship, essentially deciding who was Indigenous and who was not. Now, the government claimed that it compromised. So in 1985, it reinstated Indigenous women's citizenship to those women who had lost it. And then afterwards, it told the communities they would have the right to decide who was Indigenous. But this isn't actually what really happened in the law. So the government actually wrote more sexism into the law and then severely restricted Indigenous communities' rights to decide who was a member. So once again, I would argue three very bad outcomes, right? But here, with these three particular cases, we've got three different continents, three different decades, three different practices and three different kinds of democracies: a liberal democracy, a republic, and a post-colonial state. In fact, we've got many, many differences between these three cases. And in all three of them, women demanding their rights didn't get them. And I would argue there were bad outcomes as a result. So what we've got here then is the question of what can be done. How can we move forward? How can women in marginalized groups in democracies get their cultural rights, their religious rights, and their rights as women? And so one of the things, again, that I've been thinking about lately is a clash between culture and women's rights ever really necessary? And to answer these questions, of course, I've been studying the three controversies that I just told you about. So the 2010 French ban on the full face veil at the European Court of Human Rights, the 1998 legalization of polygyny in South Africa, and the 1985 end of the marrying out rule in Canada. Now, these controversies, again, are all happening in democracies. They're all about a marginalized group with a contested cultural and or religious practice, but otherwise they are very different. And the idea here is that whatever we can say about these three very different controversies should be generalizable to a lot of other controversies in a lot of other different places and times where cultural rights and women's rights have both been on the table. So that's why I chose these three different controversies and why I'm going to talk about them specifically going forward. So one of the interesting things that I've discovered in studying these three controversies is that in all three of them, people told stories about culture and women's rights. Now, what I mean is they made arguments, of course, but if you study the arguments that they made, you'll start to realize that they've actually got villains who are committing bad things, and there's victims who are suffering this harm, and there's heroes who are doing some rescuing and saving. And that focus on stories really helps me to understand a lot better what's going on in these three controversies. So in some of the stories that were told in these three controversies, I get the familiar culture versus women's rights conflict is motivating that story. And it was democratic officials and conservative leaders of these marginalized groups that told clash stories. But many women who these controversies were about and their allies, they didn't tell clash stories. Instead, they told what I call indivisible stories. They didn't pit culture against women's rights. Instead, they treated them as if these sets of rights were indivisible. So let me give you a familiar clash story first, and then I'll turn to an indivisible story. French government, again, notorious. This should be familiar to a few people. The victim in their story is, of course, Muslim French women who are forced to wear the full face veil, according to the French government, by patriarchal Muslim men. So the conflict that's motivating the French government story is culture versus women's rights. And the hero that steps in to save these women and save the French Republic for this oppression is, of course, the French government when it passes the 2010 ban. And the moral of this story is that the French Republic stands up for women's rights. So there we have a classic clash story. Let me turn now to an indivisible story, the stories that don't get heard very often, but that actually are being told. So here's the indivisible story that S.A.S, that anonymous applicant to the European Court of Human Rights, told when she challenged the 2010 ban that the French government had imposed. The victim here, of course, is Muslim French women who are prevented from choosing what to wear. And the villain in this story is the French government. The conflict motivating the story that S.A.S told is not culture versus women's rights. Instead, it's culture, religious, and women's rights versus an Islamic phobic state. And the hero in this story is S.A.S, who takes the French government all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. And the moral of her story is Muslim French women will save the French Republic from itself because it is violating its own rights that it has proclaimed, like the right to express one's religious faith in public. So, clash stories are ones that government officials and cultural conservatives often tell. They pit culture against women's rights. They emphasize divisions between cultural groups. So they actually attack pluralism, which is one of the underpinning values, right, of liberal democracy. And these clash stories, they attack either sexism, like the French government does, or racism, as say the conservative chiefs in Canada did. They attack the Canadian government, of course, of being racist, but they never attack both sexism and racism, which is, of course, exactly the issue for women who are in these marginalized groups. And the results of these clash stories is that they harm women in the marginalized group. Of course, government officials and cultural conservatives don't talk about that harm. I'm talking about that harm today. Indivisible stories are very different. Women in the marginalized group and their allies entwine cultural, religious, and women's rights. They center the lived experience of women. They attack racism, sexism, and the intersection of racism and sexism. So somehow I just got my, that's very odd, there we go. And they bridge differences between groups. So they're actually advancing pluralism. They're advancing cultural rights, religious rights, and women's rights all together. So let me give you some examples and then I'll wrap up. This is a quote from the Tobik Women's Political Action Group, a tiny grassroots movement in Canada that actually had a lot of political impact. They fought for decades against the marrying out rule. And this is a quote from them during their testimony to Parliament. They say, quote, "The sex-based discrimination of the present Indian Act must be abolished completely." So here they're focusing on sexism. If that sexism is not totally eliminated, its magnitude will cause further harm, not only to the women, but also to the Indian culture and the individual native societies to which they belong, unquote. And the reason, of course, is obvious. These women will be torn from their communities, and it's often women who convey their culture to the next generation. In these indivisible stories, women also center what's actually happening to them in their daily lives. So this is a quote from the Rural Women's Movement in South Africa that was run by Lydia Campe, a brilliant political tactician. And this is a quote from a submission from the Rural Women's Movement to the South African Law Commission. Quote, "Members stressed that a man cannot genuinely share his love between two women. They also noted that polygyny harms children and that houses compete for resources and are not accorded similar treatment because of favoritism by the husband. They felt that women who married more than one woman failed to support them adequately," unquote. So here we have women who live in rural areas who have experienced polygyny, arguing about what's actually happening to them on the ground. They're not attacking their culture, right? They're instead saying, look at what's going on in our everyday lives. And I think another key element of the indivisible approach is that it attacks racism and sexism and their intersections. So this is a quote from Article 19. They're an international human rights organization that submitted an amicus brief to the European Court of Human Rights. And they clearly were sympathizing with S.A.S, the anonymous applicant to the court. So this is from Article 19. Bans like the one in France, quote, "may be counterproductive. They may lead to confinement of women in the home, exclusion and marginalization of women from public life, and legitimize discrimination, physical violence, and verbal attacks against Muslim women. So here we see Article 19 concerned about the sexism that the ban might actually produce. Of course, recall that the French government said they were passing the ban in order to end sexism. And Article 19 is also acutely aware of how women are not only women, but they're Muslim women, and how there can be this kind of a racialization of Muslim women, and they may actually be physically attacked, verbally assaulted, etc. So they're aware of the ways in which racism and sexism are interacting in these women's lives. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, these indivisible stories also bridge differences between cultural groups, advancing the cause of pluralism and our ability to live together peacefully among our differences. So this is a quote from S.A.S, the anonymous applicant to the European Court of Human Rights. Quote, "I am a French citizen. I strive daily in my own personal ways to uphold the values of the Republic, of which I am acutely aware. As a French citizen, I happily interact and engage with other individuals from very diverse backgrounds of class, race, gender, faith, and sexual orientation." So here we have a French Muslim woman who wears the full face veil, insisting she is a French citizen and that she shares the values of French citizens and that she interacts with these French citizens on a daily basis. She is effectively the bridge between mainstream French citizens and Muslim French. So this, of course, raises the question of why are clash stories so popular when these indivisible stories sound so much better in so many ways. And I argue the clash stories really are drawing on what I'm calling imperial thinking. These are myths, binaries, and tropes from the colonial era that many, many people are familiar with, right? The white man's burden, that somehow cultures are distinct, static, and internally homogeneous and uncontested, and that women in marginalized groups are passive and lack political agency. And this thinking is pervasive among former and current colonizers. So former colonizers like the French, and of course, current colonizers like the Canadian government, which continues to colonize Indigenous peoples. Interestingly, I also find in my cases that versions of this imperial thinking are very common among the formerly and currently colonized, particularly cultural conservatives. So I would argue what we need to do is tell invisible stories instead, right? Which rely on intersectional thinking. The key to telling an indivisible story is to address racism and sexism and their interactions, to not forget any one of those three pieces. Anyone, if they have knowledge and familiarity about what's going on the ground in any one of these particular cases, can tell a clash story or an indivisible story. What matters are our political commitments. For an indivisible story, those political commitments would be to ending sexism, ending racism, and their intersections. So you don't have to be a particular type of identity in order to be able to tell one of these stories. So I come to that final question that I posed earlier. How can we advance justice for women in these marginalized groups? I would argue first we need to stop asking, what should be done when culture and women's rights clash? Instead, we need to use intersectional thinking to tell indivisible stories. We need to avoid a clash story. Instead, we need to entwine rights. We need to center the lived experience of these women. We need to attack racism and sexism and their intersections. That can help us to bridge differences across groups by emphasizing shared values, which can advance pluralism and cultural, religious, and women's rights. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, and I will stop sharing my screen. we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Denise Walsh. Thank you so much for a very comprehensive and enlightening presentation. It was really interesting, and I'm sure we all benefited from it. We immensely benefited. I'm sure the audience also benefited from it. Now we'll spend around 15 to 20 minutes on question and answers. We have received a few questions on different platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd also like to request our participants in the Zoom to maybe we can drop it directly to me or to everyone. So let me first, we have like 7 or 8 questions that we have received. We are getting more, our team is putting more questions. First is that like some of the questions we have also received during the registration. So you might have covered them. So if you want, you can skip those parts. Like, how do you look at human right? And there is a question that why do they confuse human rights with the human right of women? Whether there is a difference between human right of women or human right in general. That is one question that we have received. Second is that how do you look at the relationship between women and class that you just mentioned? If you want to add more, maybe these are the 2 questions that we have to raise in the first round.
Yeah. Let me take the second first one about class, which I think is terribly important. And absolutely, the intersections don't have to be sexism and racism. In the cases that I've looked at, that's what I've seen. So while I've been very attentive to class differences in my research, looking for it, I can't say that it's come up in my the 3 cases that I've looked at. And it may be that that has to do with some of the, I would say, still ongoing legacies of neoliberalism, that people don't feel that making class demands is as effective in the contemporary era as making demands related to culture and women's rights. But I can't say for sure because I haven't done extensive research on that. So I think this is a terrific question and something that really begs for more research. The first question, what's the distinction between human rights and women's rights? So I would say that since 1995, I believe, or 1996, that was a critical turning point in the international arena of human rights. There was a conference, a UN conference in Beijing, where many different people declared women's rights were human rights were women's rights. Of course, one of the people most celebrated for making that declaration was Hillary Clinton. But since then, the international so-called community has very much advanced this kind of idea that women's rights and human rights are actually one and the same.
We're getting more questions now popping up. So let me look at another 2. Like, how do you look at the hijab ban in educational institutions in Turkey and Islamic State? That is one. Second is that we have Nisita, who is saying that you have rightly pointed out the instance of Karnataka government Islamophobic as well as patriarchal move to regulate women's bodies and attire. The instance has manifest that the practice itself is structurally aided or perhaps aided by the state machinery. However, in case of the US, where women have the right to choose their attire, there is an implicit or sometimes explicit discriminatory attitude and practice among Muslim women. So would you say that the former, where the patriarchal and Islamophobic practice, which is a state-aided, makes it more difficult for women? Also, how do women negotiate with patriarchy while claiming public spaces in places like the United States?
Okay. Oh, I see. This is written out, so I could actually, because I couldn't quite follow all of that. So the first question about Turkey, right? So these are countries that are not, I think we would argue, liberal democracies, right? Iran is another example like that one. And again, my research looks specifically at countries where both cultural rights and women's rights are endorsed. So in countries where that's not the case, you're not going to get quite the same dynamics. And so I haven't done research on non-democracies. I've tried to focus very much on democracies, but I think it would be interesting, very interesting, to look at what many women in Turkey who want to wear the headscarf, right, what they are saying, and whether they're also entwining culture and women's rights. I mean, I haven't read and studied them to the same degree that I have in 3 cases I've looked at. My guess is that that very well could be, in which case we would have to think about, how can we advance both at the same time? And I would argue that, telling these different stories would be a good step in the right direction. In terms of the very nice question that I can now see here in the chat, I agree with so much that's been written here. So would you say that the former, where the patriarchal and Islamic phobic practice, which is state aided, makes it more difficult for women? Absolutely. So these are so the former, I trust, is something you've rightly pointed out, the Institute of Karnataka's government Islamophobic is yes. So I think this does make it more difficult for women. This is very much similar in France, right? I mean, there's a sort of the government says it's actually advancing women's rights, and it would say that it's all for gender equality, but in effect, it's taking the choice of women to choose what to wear away from them, right? This is what someone like S.A.S. would say. She would say that this is paternalistic, and that it's also Islamophobic. So in terms of making it more difficult than in the US, I think if you mean different, if you mean politically, or if you mean it actually in their everyday lives. So in their everyday lives, certainly in France, women are, not able to wear the face veil. I mean, it's completely illegal. So yes, in their everyday lives, that encourages violence, and the state is actually encouraging violence through the law. So I would say that that kind of harm is exacerbated in France as opposed to in the United States. In terms of the politics of it, I'm not so sure. I think then, we would, how does one resist this, right? So S.A.S. can actually go to the European Court of Human Rights and challenge the law. But in the United States, there's no law to challenge, right? So then one has to fight, more in society as opposed to being able to go to a court. Now, of course, the European Court of Human Rights did not uphold or see on this, decide on the side of S.A.S. But at least she had a chance to do that. So politically, it's a little bit more complicated. So how do women negotiate with patriarchy while also claiming public spaces in places like the United States? Yes, so I think this is where you see Ilhan Omar doing this really rather brilliantly. I mean, she is not at all, saying that she's a victim, right? I mean, she very much fights back. She's very direct in her comments. And I think this is partly why she wants to dispel these kinds of pervasive stereotypes about Muslim women that exist in the United States and other places, and to be very clear that she is quite agentic, and it is not going to be deterred by the kind of browbeating that she's getting from many Republicans. Oh, I think I've tackled all of those, but I'm guessing you have more.
Yes, thank you. We have got lots of questions within this periphery where they say that most of the discrimination against women are in the name of culture, be it religion, values, norms. At the same time, any attack on culture gets a strong resistance. In such a situation, how can we effectively fight against discrimination against women and not getting attacked by those who want to claim culture? So that is another question of that.
Yes, I love this question. This is the question that motivated this research. I was in South Africa doing research on my first book, and this just came to the fore. And so I think the answers to this are very much what we saw the Tobique women doing in Canada, as well as women in South Africa doing very different cases, somewhat different strategies because they were such different controversies. So what we see in South Africa is this law is getting passed right as the country has transitioned to democracy. A new constitution has just been written and passed in 1996. And of course, you think about Nelson Mandela, it guarantees everyone the right to equality. This is not at all surprising. So the rural women's movement points to this right. And they say, look, the new constitution guarantees us the right to equality, us as rural women, not just because we're, Black women, but because we're women too, that this is also in the Constitution. So we're entitled to both. What they don't do is they do not attack their culture, right? They simply say, this is a matter of everyone in South Africa being entitled to equality, and we're entitled to equality too. Now, in Canada, Indigenous women take a different tact because it's a different context, right? So they talk about the fact that they are, as women, entitled to their equality. And as Indigenous people, they're also entitled to their culture, and their culture needs them, right? So they don't attack their culture. They just say that they're entitled to equality and they're entitled to their culture. They want both. So they find a way to entwine both of these rights together. And it's really the vast majority of the stories that I read in these three cases do not pit culture against women's rights. It's the cultural conservatives who do this and liberal democratic officials who are doing this. And they have a lot of power. So it's actually not that difficult, I don't think, to tell these indivisible stories. It's about how to get them heard.
You just mentioned cultural conservatives, and there are lots of questions within those periphery. Like there's lots of questions that in non-Western world, it is often accused that women following the Western culture is considered free, or adopting Western political system is called democracy. So how can it protect our culture still providing equality to women without importing Western cultures? So there is lots of questions within those,
Yes.
kind of questions are there. Another is,
Yeah.
how do you realize the strategies to promote human rights in such traditional communities and democracies? There's another question we have received on Zoom.
Right. So I think the first question, about how do women and communities not feel like they're just taking on something from the West. And I think that this is simply this isn't true, right? So we see, if we actually look in many different communities, we will find women in those communities wanting change in their lives, whether they appeal to women's rights that have been handed down through the UN or in their constitution, as in the case of South Africa, right? Or not, whether they're just saying they want a change. We can see so many women, regardless of their language, asking for some kind of difference in their lives to make their lives better. Right. So this notion that, women's rights are Western is just absurd. It may be, certainly there are civil and political rights that are often associated with liberal democracy. But if we look at what the content of women's rights actually are at the international level, we see that that includes women's rights to not be objectified by the media, for instance, which certainly is violated every day, every minute in the United States, right? So women don't have their rights here. And we can also see other types of rights, as the right to leadership roles in fighting climate change. So women's rights extend far beyond civil and political rights to also include social rights, economic rights, rights to clean water, for instance. I mean, clean water is obviously something that women across sub-Saharan Africa constantly demand. But it's often people don't think about that as a women's right, but many women in sub-Saharan Africa actually claim that as a women's right. So again, actually listening to the women on the ground and hearing what they're saying about their daily lives really helps us with that problem. The second one, remind me, that was about how to, I think I've answered both, but I'm not quite sure if I did the second one.
Okay, so let's move to, we have a few more questions coming up. So there's it says that though women represent half of the population, almost equal number of women in all countries, all societies, still the representation of women around the world is not so impressive. So be it developed countries or developing countries. So where does the problem lie? Is it in the culture or literacy, or is it economy or politics? Where does the problem lie at the moment?
Right. So yes, women's representation in politics, and even when we get a large number of women in politics, it doesn't necessarily translate into more women's rights, because not all women, of course, are interested in advancing women's rights. And there's also political parties and political structures that can limit what women politicians do and say. So what we know from a vast amount of research in politics and gender is that if you want to advance, or I would, instead of using the words women's rights, I would just simply say, if you want to make women's lives better, women's daily lives better, what you really need is to create a women's movement. And it can be as small as that Indigenous women's movement, that grassroots movement in Tobique in Canada, right? It can be like the rural women's movement in Canada. It can be a much larger women's movement, but that sits at the base of where we see change. So if we want change in violence against women in terms of laws and implementation, for instance, we know that we need women and others, their allies, to organize, and they can do this not simply in civil society and on the streets, but within institutions, right? So within political parties, within trade unions. This was absolutely crucial, for instance, in South Africa, where women's rights advanced quite significantly under the law with the transition to democracy. And there had been decades of women working within the ANC, the African National Congress political party, as well as within trade unions across the country to advance women's rights. And when the transition to democracy came, the leaders of those trade unions, the leaders of those political parties, found it completely natural, and I've got the pressure from women within their organizations to advance women's rights.
Thank you. There's one question which is very interesting. It says that our cultures and tradition unchangeable. In South Asia, women are not allowed to go to temples, or certain temples, not allowed to get involved into certain professions. If it is, how can we make like culture or tradition that is undiscriminatory, how we can transform into that process? That is one question we have got from.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much. So I think the whole problem here is that we think that somehow cultures don't change, when we know, in fact, it's just the opposite. Cultures get invented. We all are participating in them, and they change over time. They change with climate change, for instance. They change with political parties. They change because of the economy, right? And it's when people tell us that they can't change, and they use the rules about women as somehow a marker that this is the essence of our culture, that we run into problems. So it's I think very important, as the Indigenous women in Canada did, rural women in South Africa did, to not attack their culture, and instead to say, you know, we are part of this culture, and here's one thing that we think needs to be done in order for our culture to survive and thrive. Because after all, as one of your questioners already said, women make up half of the community, right?
Sorry.
Is there anything else that we should discuss?
Yeah, we still have lots of questions. Let me take, we're running out of time. Let me take just 2 or 3 questions maximum. Like, there's one question: how do you think globalization, where there is mixing of culture, understanding, exchanges taking place, in this situation, how does it impact the woman identity?
Yeah, sure. So I think something like that can often encourage groups that feel under siege to take this view of culture that the previous questioner indicated, that culture can't change. Right. So there's ways in which we see right now, I think, a kind of reaction to globalization, right? A kind of, battening down the hatches and not thinking about, pluralism so much, but about how we can defend what we have. And that's a huge challenge, no doubt. This is, again, gets back to how do we get those indivisible stories heard? And I think one of the ways that we do that is by challenging what this previous questioner asked about, this essentialist version of culture, that there's one way to think about culture, when in fact, if we look closely, we see people practicing their culture in many, many different ways, even within a family, right? Let alone, women and men doing things different. Rural communities do it somewhat differently than urban communities. Different classes have different kinds of practices. So once we bring that heterogeneity to the fore, then we can begin to ask, how can we ensure that our culture thrives and is dynamic, and so that we can move into whatever the world brings next. And I think it's that kind of orientation toward culture that's really, really needed right now.
There are a few questions on like how does culture impact our values of women? Do you think that there is some kind of changes taking place in terms of women values because of culture and globalization? There are lots of questions within that periphery that how do culture impact our values of women?
Our values of women or women's values? Which one is it?
It says our value of women.
Yeah. Right. So there are many ways in which specific interpretations of culture might be negative toward women, but there are many other interpretations of that same culture that can be positive, right? So culture is always remade and reformulated, and it's filtered through our daily lives and our own experiences. So it's what we make of our culture ultimately, right? So it's so when I say we, of course, it's not any one particular person, and those who have, so if cultural conservatives are in power and they wish to preserve a particular interpretation, then it can be very negative for women or particular types of women, right, in terms of their lived experience and their daily lives. But I don't think any one culture has a monopoly on that, right? Any one culture can be interpreted in so many different ways. And so it's incumbent on all of us, right, to think about how, again, can we make our culture thrive? How can we live it in a way in which the people who are part of our community feel supported and and want to be part of this community, and bring it into into the future. I mean, we walk with it instead of thinking about pitting ourselves against it. I mean, how could anyone live without their culture? I just simply can't imagine such a thing. Certainly, I couldn't imagine that for me. So it's about, how do we make it dynamic in a way that serves us and holds our community together in ways that we think are positive.
Maybe we can take it to the last question, and you have answered it in different parts of different questions. Like, can cultural conservatism make women more vulnerable to violence? How can it be a threat to women's rights and others? So there is one question on cultural conservatism making women more vulnerable to violence, and how does it threaten women's rights?
Mm-hmm. Right. So I wanted. So cultural conservatism is a giant label, and we haven't really spent a lot of time unpacking what it means. So I'm a bit hesitant to continue to make like broad statements or claims. What I would say is often cultural conservatives want to protect women from violence. So when I think about some of the ways that they do that, I get concerned, but I think that the impulse of ending gender-based violence is a good one. And I wouldn't want to attack that. What I would want to do is I would want to hear people who care about ending gender-based violence to come together and listen to the people who've experienced it, and to think about ways and work together about how to address it. So again, I would go back to those stories that we tell, right? So there's many stories about gender-based violence that the statistics simply don't support. So that, when women go out into the streets or into the public sphere, that's where they are most vulnerable, when in fact we know that gender-based violence is committed by those in situations which people know each other. Right. And so this is a very hard conversation. I don't necessarily think it's about culture or cultural conservatives, because it happens everywhere, right, around the world. So it can't be specific to any one particular culture or simply just to conservatives. So again, it goes back to the stories that we tell ourselves about what's causing the problem. And I would urge us all to think about those who are being harmed, to listen specifically to the harms that are happening to them, and to think about the multiple vectors or systems of oppression that may be impacting them. So it may be class, it may be race, and maybe sexuality, and how those things come together in ways to make that particular person and others like them vulnerable to violence. And I think that that's something that many of us can agree is something we want to change.
Professor Denise Walsh, thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. We don't get to have such enriched discussion often. We are really grateful for your valuable time. I, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence. We hope to have you in real, maybe in Kathmandu in future. We'd also like to thank all our audience for their wonderful question. Thank you so much and have a nice day, and good night to our friends from Asia.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful questions. Fantastic.